Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Handan in Seoul. Amid heightened tensions in the Middle East, the world had its eyes fixed on Iran's presidential election results over the weekend, which is shaping out to be one of the most unpredictable in Iran's recent history. We're yet to find out who will replace former President Ebrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash in May, as none of the candidates succeeded in winning over 50% of the votes required under the Iranian election law to secure an outright victory. Iranians will head back to the polls this week to decide between a reformist and a hardline conservative who will go head-to-head in a runoff election. For an in-depth analysis on Iran's presidential election, its global implications, as well as escalating tensions in the Middle East, we have Choi Hyun Jin, Associate Professor of Political Science at Kyung Hee University, joining us in the studio. It's always great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And joining us from Washington is VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. It's always great to see you, Jessica.
Good evening.
All right, let's start off with you. Iran will hold a runoff election this Friday to choose between two top contenders, reformist Masoud Pezeshkian and hardliner Saeed Jalili. First, tell us about who they are.
Well, I think it's important at the outset just to remember that the Ayatollah Khamenei is really in charge. So this election is unlikely to shift major policies, but certainly the presidents of the country implement those policies. So in terms of your question, the lineup is as thus. Jalili is a former Revolutionary Guard, so clearly much more of a hardliner. He's a protege of the Iran's supreme leader, and he has failed in his former nuclear negotiations, but he was a part of them. He has strong anti-Western views. And on the other side, we have Pezeshkian, who is pretty low profile up until this point. He's the only moderate in the field of candidates. He wants more outreach with the West, in particular to revive Iran's struggling economy. And on the mandate that has been much talked about and much covered for women to wear hijab, he says that he will follow the law, but he condemns anyone who enforces intrusive or inhumane behavior towards women. Now, another thing just to keep in mind in terms of these two men is that there is still pretty low turnout predicted. And so poll watchers are really watching to see how that will affect the election, in particular, the turnout for Pezeshkian.
I think you highlighted an important point there that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is Iran's supreme leader who holds the country's most of the country's power. But looking at the election results, Pezeshkian secured over 42% of the vote, while Jalili came second with around 39% in the first round of election, according to local authorities. But most experts point out that in order for a popular reformist to win, a high voter turnout is required, but Iran saw a record low turnout with only about 40% of eligible voters casting ballots. So it seems like the Iranian people are losing interest and faith in politics. And in related question, Professor Che, Masoud Pezeshkian, Iran's sole reformist candidate, has risen from a relative obscurity to becoming a top contender, which was quite stunning for both supporters and rivals alike. What does this imply about the current state of Iran's politics and also about the Iranian public sentiment?
Okay, you just mentioned the voting turnout. It was only about 40%. It was the record low and the lowest since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So there have been tough economic times and the big protests for years under the Shia government. And it seems like the people showed their frustration by choosing not to vote this time. So this low voting turnout rate is very important. So in this context, Pezeshkian's surprising rise shows several key points about Iranian politics and how people are feeling nowadays. So the first point is Iranian people are looking for change. The Pezeshkian becoming popular shows that many people in Iran want something different, and they might be tired of economic struggles and strict rules and feeling cut off from the rest of the world. And for this reason, the people who want changes might vote rather strategically for Pezeshkian And that's why, even though he was not well known at first, but he now looks like the best chance for making a difference in Iranian politics. And the second point is, in Iran, the reformist ideas are still popular. So even though reformist candidates often face challenges such as media restriction and being disqualified from election, but Pezeshkian's success shows that the many Iranians still support for changing how things are run, including making government, society, and also their economy better. And lastly, Iran has a lot of young people who might prefer more openness and connections with other countries. And Pezeshkian's appeal might be stronger among this younger generation in Iran. And in short, Pezeshkian's surprising rise shows that many people in Iran are ready for new approaches and improvement how their country is run.
So the fact that reformist Pezeshkian came out first in the first round of the election itself speaks volumes about the Iranian people's discontent toward the current situation, toward the current government. As you pointed out, they want a change. And the low voter turnout also reflects Iranian public's anger about the country's crippled economy, as you mentioned. Jessica, the reformist candidate, Pezeshkian, has called for reviving the 2015 nuclear deal with the U.S. and other world powers, which sought to curb Tehran's nuclear activity in return for sanctions relief. Meanwhile, ultra-conservative former nuclear negotiator Saeed Jalili has staunchly opposed the deal. How is the U.S. reacting to the election developments, and do pundits favor Pezeshkian over Jalili?
Yeah, they absolutely do. I mean, he is the pro-Western candidate. He's the pro-engagement candidate. And so the pundits definitely favor him. He's also in favor of social liberalization and political pluralism, which are values that are closely held in the United States and much of the West. So Washington experts also are concerned that Iran is increasingly growing closer with Russia and with China, forming an axis that challenges the Western world. And of course, the lifting of sanctions under the Biden administration have made that easier for Iran to do increased trade, especially with China when it comes to oil sales. Trita Parsi here in Washington, he's a well-known Iran hand, and he says that Washington should really keep a low expectation, though, of a revival of that deal, that the opening that happened back in 2013 under Barack Obama is simply not there. Essentially, Tehran has other options besides Washington to do business, to increase its economic prospects with those other countries. And the trust deficit, he also adds, is much wider between Washington and Tehran than it was in 2013.
The fate of the nuclear deal and Iran's future relations with the U.S. will not only depend on Iran's election results, but also on America's November 5th presidential election. Now, while last week's Biden-Trump TV debate offered little clue about their Iran policy, what are the two candidates' respective policy directions toward the Islamic Republic, especially on the nuclear deal?
Well, it didn't come up much in the debate except as a punching bag, but it has come up in conversations that, for example, Donald Trump has had with a podcast recently called All In. He said he would negotiate a fair deal with Iran. He said it's harder now than it was when he was last president because of the lifting of sanctions. And he also even went so far to say is that he believes Iran could still benefit or become part of the Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations between Israel and its neighbors. Biden's administration has continued to have indirect talks with Iranian officials to advance a nuclear deal, but it's certainly not a front burner issue for the Biden administration, as we've talked about at length. Other world events in Ukraine and Israel are much more at the forefront. He has allowed Iran to access some of its frozen assets abroad. And even Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, who, of course, was a key player in the negotiation of the 2015 nuclear deal, said Biden's policies have made it possible for Tehran to profit off its oil reserves, 2.5 million barrels sold each day, most of it to China.
But even so, all in all, both President Biden and former President Trump have left little incentive for Tehran to engage more closely with Washington. And experts point out that no matter who sits in the White House, there's widespread fear, if you will, across Iran's political spectrum that at the end of the day, any U.S. president would be after a regime change in Iran.
Very true.
But we'll see if Iran's election results could perhaps reshape the current dynamics. Now, Professor Choi, how would Iran's election results impact the country's foreign policy directions depending on the outcome?
Okay, so as we know, Iran is an Islamic theocracy, right? Where the president is less powerful than the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who controls the military and oversees executive and also judicial matters. So therefore, I think this presidential election doesn't dramatically change the nature of Iranian politics, but still, in the area of foreign relations, we could expect some changes in Iranian foreign policy. So let me give you two scenarios. If Pezeshkian wins, he would like to try to improve a relationship with the Western countries. And this could include working to revive or change international deals like the nuclear agreement, and possibly reducing the UN-imposed sanctions through diplomacy. And also, his government might also focus on getting the economy back on track, possibly by looking for new international trade deal and reconnecting with the international organizations and other Western countries that had distanced themselves under more conservative leadership. But on the other hand, if Saeed Jalili wins, and he would probably keep up or even increase Iran's resistance to Western influence. And this could mean being more self-reliant or less willing to make deals in nuclear talks, and possibly taking a tougher stance in regional conflict, such as the war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. And Jalili might also aim to strengthen ties with other allies, such as Russia and China, and also reinforce connection with the groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Syrian government, and also Houthi rebels in Yemen within the so-called the axis of resistance. And overall, depending on who wins this upcoming election, Iran's foreign policy might lean towards more openness and negotiation, or towards greater isolation and assertiveness in the regional matters.
Those two sound like very contrasting results. Right. You mentioned that Pezeshkian, he believes that by improving relations with other countries, including the West, could help Iran lift sanctions and thereby boost domestic economy. So we're expecting a more interactive foreign policy from the reformist candidate, whereas Jalili has no interest whatsoever in mending ties with the West. But it looks like both countries are quite focused on increasing ties with China and Russia,
yes,
which could potentially become a threat to global security. But that opens up a whole other conversation. Now, Jessica, meanwhile, in Gaza, Israeli attacks intensified, killing dozens, despite Prime Minister Netanyahu's previous claims that the war is nearing an end. That's as ceasefire talks are still stuck in limbo. Give us the latest developments in Gaza.
Well, just overnight here in Washington, we received news that the Israeli army has released 50 detainees, including the director of Al-Shifa Hospital, which, of course, became a big story early on in the conflict for accusations that it was sheltering Hamas militants. The detainees have been released, and yet the Israeli army continues to push into parts of Gaza, both in the north and in the south. And so, as you point out, that conflict is increasing, and the military movements are as well. Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, isn't showing any possibility of really relenting on the military action. He said again Sunday that Israel would continue its war against Hamas until all of the hostages have been returned. But there's increasing evidence that these two goals are, of course, at odds, because how do you get the hostages returned and how do you keep them safe in Gaza while prosecuting the war against Hamas. And this is being raised by people both inside Israel and outside Israel increasingly. There's been 38,000 deaths of civilians, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. And so the conflict is raging on, and it's threatening to spill over because we see Lebanon, in the home base of the Iran-backed Hezbollah militants, as the professor mentioned. There are increasing exchanges between Hezbollah and Israel. They've escalated this month, and on Saturday, Iran itself warned that regional allies would confront Israel if Tel Aviv were to launch an attack on Lebanon in retaliation for the actions of Hezbollah.
As you mentioned, Jessica, Prime Minister Netanyahu once again made clear that Israel will continue fighting in Gaza until Hamas is eliminated and all the other goals of the war are achieved, including freeing all the remaining hostages held in the Gaza Strip. Now, the prospects for Israel and Hamas striking a deal on ceasefire talks is also looking bleak. Now, meanwhile, Professor Choi, as Jessica alluded, the U.S. and Europe have warned Lebanon's Hezbollah to back off from wider regional conflict in the Middle East. And this as tensions between Israel and Hezbollah escalate to dangerous levels. How do you gauge the possibility of a full-scale war erupting between the two sides, and also on the possibility of Iran's intervention?
The forecasting in diplomacy is very challenging. Okay. But anyway, since the conflict in Gaza Strip, since last October, there have been more frequent exchange of fire between Hezbollah and the Israeli military. And Israeli officials have a clear warning that Israel could invade Lebanon if Hezbollah doesn't leave the border area. And in response, Hezbollah has threatened moving into Israel too. And furthermore, Iran has also warned that there could be a devastating war if Israel launches a major attack in Lebanon. So this shows that there are many exchange of very hostile statements between Hezbollah, Israel, and Iranian government. But however, diplomats are trying to keep this situation from turning into a larger war. And that's why Israel's defense minister recently visited Washington, D.C. to discuss the ongoing tension between Israel and Hezbollah. For now, I think a full-scale war between these two sides and also Iran is unlikely to happen, at least in the near future. And here is why. First, the United States is very concerned about preventing a situation where Iran and Israel end up fighting against each other. And secondly, Israel's defense minister explained to U.S. officials in Washington, D.C. that Israel does not want a full-scale war with Hezbollah, although it is ready to strongly respond if attacked. And finally, I also believe that Iran wants to avoid directly confronting Israel as well. So as we saw in this April, both Israel and Iran exchanged some rockets and a drone attack. However, their exchange of fire was done in a very limited fashion. And this shows that both Israel and Iran didn't want to escalate their conflict into a larger scale war. And that's why I believe that a full-scale war, including these three parties, Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran, are less likely to happen in the near future. However, the situation needs close watching because things can change very quickly. And ultimately, ending the war in the Gaza Strip would be the best way to ease tension between Israel and Hezbollah.
The last thing the world would want right now is another war in the Middle East. And I think you've offered some relief on the horizon that, at least for the time being, a full-scale, full-blown war between Israel and Hezbollah looks unlikely, at least for the time being. Now, what are the critical points of concern for South Korea as we continue to watch mounting tensions in the Middle East?
Okay, so South Korea has several critical concerns to the rising tension in the Middle East. The first one is economic stability and oil supply. So countries like South Korea depend a lot on oil imports, mainly from the Middle East. So any conflict in the region could cut off oil supply, increase prices, and negatively affect Korean economy. And if tensions arise, things could worsen very quickly. And therefore, it's crucial to prepare for the worst-case scenario, such as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So if this strait is closed, experts predict that oil prices could shoot up to $150 per barrel, which is about twice the current prices. So such a rise in oil price could cause inflation and higher costs in almost all industry that heavily rely on energy. And the second issue is about trade and investment. The Middle East is very important for South Korean exports and also foreign investments. And for example, Korea is now trying to increase its military sales to countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also UAE. So, however, any instability in the region could damage these economic ties and hurting South Korean companies there, and also possibly causing a lot of financial losses. And therefore, the South Korean government must develop the plans to protect its economy and keep a close eye on the region's political situation to react fastly and effectively to any changes in the region.
So potential huge economic losses for South Korea if tensions continue to mount in the Middle East. Well, the Middle East is now at a critical juncture amid the war in Gaza that's yet to be over, with Netanyahu vowing to fight on, and with the tensions between Israel and Hezbollah mounting to something more alarming than before. We'll leave our discussion there, but we'll continue to closely watch the developments in the Middle East, including Iran's July 5th runoff election. Thank you so much, as always, Professor Choi, for your brilliant analysis. And many thanks to you as well, Jessica, for your insights, for sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.